end of the third week, beginning of the fourth week after fertilization. And so here you can see, you have this diagram in your lecture notes. So here are the two dorsal aortas. They fuse together to form a single vessel, and you have two vessels coming in and two vessels leaving. Obviously, with the mature heart, we have more vessels than that. We have two vessels coming into the atria, right atria, four vessels coming into the left atria, but the pattern here is established. And I have a couple of videos to show. But when we go from 2 to 1, we have a single pump. And we have two vessels coming in. So what do we call vessels that are carrying blood to the heart? Are they under low pressure or high pressure? Low pressure. So they are veins. And this is our pump. And so we have two vessels leaving, and those are under higher pressure because blood flows from high to low pressure. So these are arteries. And even in this simple system, you can see the dual circulation that we talk about with the cardiovascular system. We have a systemic circuit and a pulmonary circuit. All right? So with even a simple system, we would have blood coming into the heart from the body. And over here, blood coming into the heart from the pulmonary system. And then blood going to the body. And blood going to the pulmonary system. Now, a few years ago, I had a student request, a friend of hers, son had been suspended from high school, expelled, and behavioral issues. And part of his, transition school that he was in, he had to do community service. And so she asked if he could come and speak to the class about his particular condition. He was born with a hole between his left and right ventricle. And we'll talk about that probably tomorrow or next week when we talk about some of these congenital conditions. And the way that the heart was set up actually wasn't a hole, it was the transposition of the great vessels. And so his aorta was coming out of his right ventricle, and his pulmonary trunk was coming out of his left ventricle. So what you had was the right ventricle was receiving blood from the body and pumping blood to the body. So it was going body to heart to body to heart. And his pulmonary trunk was coming out of the left ventricle, was coming out of the left ventricle and pumping to the lungs. So we had it coming, so the right side was body to body, coming from the body, going to the body. The left side was coming from the lungs, and instead of being pumped to the body through the aorta, it was being pumped back to the lungs again.
The muscles weren't getting oxygen.
So the lung was getting oxygen, and the heart was getting oxygen, but the body wasn't, and which is okay in field development because there are connections, and the blood's coming from the placenta anyway, not the lungs. And most babies that are born with this condition have connections that allow the blood to be mixed, and they can live for a few hours or weeks until surgery is done. He had no connections, so his circuit was completely separate. And so I told him his circuits were like this. Most people's are like this. So they come into the body, go out to the lungs, come from the body to the heart, go to the lungs, come back to the heart, go to the body. So you have this kind of figure 8 kind of pumping. So they had to do surgery, within minutes after birth, seconds after they cut the umbilical cord, to create an opening and allow that blood to be mixed. So as we look through, we start out with a single pump, okay? And the formation of the heart, it twists. So what starts here, blood is entering into the atria in the body. Here, the atria would be at the bottom, and the blood is being pumped from the ventricles. And as the heart forms, it rotates until the atria are on top and the ventricle is on the bottom. And the single chamber gets divided into 4. So this is just a really quick video kind of showing the changes that go through in the development of a frog. It's an animation, and then I have a longer video that you don't need to know the level of development, I just want to give you an idea of how complex. So here's the single tube. Here's the rotation around. Ventricles on the bottom, atria at the top. Okay, so now let's, in a frog there are 3. There are 2 ventricles, and we'll get to that in just a moment. There are 2 ventricles and the 2 ventricles and, 2 atria and a ventricle. So, you don't need to know the names of all of these different truncus arteriosus and sinus and conus and all that kind of thing, but I just want you to get an idea of the complexity of this. So remember the folding that we talked about? Okay, here are the 2 vessels that are going to join together, and the heart develops from the mesoderm in the upper portion in this area right here, grows into the center. Blood cells are migrating in from the yolk sac. So at the end of the 3rd week, beginning of the 4th week, we have this single pump that starts to contract, all right, when it's just barely, 21, 22 days old. So again, you don't need to know the bulbous cordis or these parts, but it's labeled there so you can see what's going to form. So here are the two vessels coming in from the bottom. These are going to form the atria, and the 2 vessels leaving from the top. And it starts to rotate around. So the blue is going to be the atria. And now that yellow is the pulmonary trunk. It's going to be one of the large vessels leaving the right ventricle and going to the lungs. Okay, and then I have, here's a more mature heart. So after we've gone through the structures of the heart, if you go back to these images, those names will mean a little bit more to you. Let's see.
The heart consists of a simple tube. It's anchored at one end by the differentiating arterial trunks, and at the other by extensive venous channels which drain into the atrium. Being fixed at both ends, the cardiac tube grows rapidly in length, and the embryonic ventricle is bent into a loop to the right of the midline. As development continues, the ventricular region swings back to the midline and expands and grows in length to cover the atrium and great veins.
Notice how the atrium moves up into the back.
Extensive circulations projecting laterally will ultimately become the right atrium and left atrium. The future left ventricle lies to the left of the interventricular groove, and the embryonic right ventricular or bulboconus region communicates with the truncus arteriosus.
That's going to be the
A
pulmonary
fortunate
trunk.
heart is formed from this convoluted tube by the development of 3 septa, partitioning the atria, the ventricles, and the truncus arteriosus. Although these septa develop simultaneously, they will be considered individually. By viewing the heart from the right side, partitioning of the atria and ventricles can be more easily visualized.
So this would
Externally,
be
A deep groove separates the
atrium,
atrium
right
from the
ventricle.
ventricle. Within the heart, the atrioventricular groove appears as a deep invagination which constricts the atrioventricular canal at its waist. The canal becomes divided along its longitudinal axis by two partitions, growing from the walls of the two common chambers toward the auricular-ventricular junction. Endocardial cushions extend from opposite sides of the atrioventricular aperture and ultimately fuse into a column dividing the channel between the atrium and ventricle. From the interventricular ridge, proliferating muscular septum advances across the common ventricle toward the base of the heart. Simultaneously, the interatrial septum rapidly grows toward the endocardial cushions, progressively constricting the foramen between the atrial chambers, the foramen primum. Before the foramen primum becomes obliterated, a new opening appears high on the interatrial septum. The timely development of this orifice, the foramen secundum, provides uninterrupted shunting of blood from the right atrium directly into the left. Another interatrial septum, the septum secundum, develops from a ridge just to the right of the septum primum and extends down like a curtain over the interatrial fenestration.
It's like
The
two
advanced edge
pocket
of the
doors
septum
that slide
secundum
past each other.
forms the foramen ovale, with the septum primum acting as a unidirectional flutter valve. Thus, blood can flow only from the right atrium to the left. To recapitulate, the common atrioventricular canal is partitioned by the simultaneous proliferation of the endocardial cushions, the muscular interventricular septum, and the interatrial septum.
All right, so again, all these different terms, septum primum, septum secundum, you don't have to know. Just wanted you to appreciate the complexity of that. And now we start out, this is what you need to know, which is up on the board. Two tubes fused together to create a single pump, and then in the human, that single pump becomes two double pumps. All right, so I want to look at why we need two double pumps in the human. So here you can see some of that separation that they were talking about, and the formation of the foramen ovale is shown down here. We'll talk about the significance of that again when we talk about fetal circulation. So in the human heart, we have four chambers, and that's what we're going to spend our time talking about today. Two receiving chambers and two pumping chambers, all right? The frog heart and fish heart have only one ventricle and two atria. So if you look at a frog heart, it has a right atrium, a left atrium, and a single pump that pumps out to the body into the gills at the same time. In humans, we have a right atrium, a left atrium, a right ventricle, and a left ventricle. And the right ventricle will pump to the lungs, and the left ventricle will pump to the body. At the same time, the same volume, but two different forces. Why do we need two different pressures? When you look at the sheep heart today, you'll notice that the right ventricle has a very thin wall, the left ventricle has a very thick wall. So if you're only lifting weights with one upper extremity and the other is in a cast or is paralyzed, you'll notice a big difference in muscle size.
Is that because it needs more pressure to circulate through the whole body?
Exactly. So why doesn't it need more pressure as a fetus? What does a fetus heart have in common with a single pumping chamber that a frog or a fish would have?
A small body?
It's just pumping it out to the organs.
It doesn't have oxygen in its lungs, so it's not getting, it doesn't
Okay, the interface, so we have, again, remember, we have two circulatory systems. We have systemic, where we have the left side of the heart pumping through all the capillaries of the body tissues. We have the right side of the heart pumping through pulmonary vessels. So what would the fetus have in common with the amphibious frog or the fish in their water environment?
It's using its gills.
Gills?
It's using its gills like the placenta.
Okay, so what would be,
Placenta-like gills.
so what's going to surround the gills in a fish? What surrounds the gills? Water. Okay? All right, good. So if we have our capillary, and I'm not a vertebrate fish anatomist here, but if we have our capillary with blood, and we'll put the gill tissue around it, we have water. So that water pressure is going to try to collapse the vessels. It's going to exert a force on the thin-walled capillary, and the heart's pressure, the heart's contracting force, is going to push out against that. All right, so this would be the fetal or amphibious fish or frogs circulation in the lungs or gills. Once the baby takes a breath, all right, just prior to the baby being born, so if this is in the fetus, this would not be the water of the lake or the ocean, but this would be the alveolus. This would be one of the tiny little air sacs. The air sacs are filled with fluid during fetal development. If they're not, they would grow solid. So a few weeks prior to the fetus being born, that water is reabsorbed back into the body tissues. And plus, a vaginal birth helps to squeeze out more of it as well. And the baby takes its first breath, and those alveolar air sacs open up. The force that the heart is required to use to pump blood through here drops dramatically. If it continued to pump at that rate, at that same force as it would have to do if it had a single pump, that high pressure against having air would cause fluid from the capillaries to seep into those air sacs, and you'd end up with pulmonary edema. So after the baby is born, the alveolar air sacs have air. And thus we don't want to use as much force as the blood is passing through there. If we did, we'd end up with fluid actually in the air sacs. So we have a two-pressure system, hence two pumps. Same volume, 70 mils out of the left side, 70 mils out of the right side in the adult, two different pressure systems. And I actually described that a little bit a little farther on in your lecture notes on page 14. You just kind of annotate your notes there for that. Now let's look at the heart and location. Just where it starts with chambers of the heart, if you have it printed off from online. So it starts talking about chambers of the heart is where I describe those functions. May I erase the board? So in 430, you learned about the dorsal cavity of the skull and the vertebral column, the bony cavities, and the ventral cavity, which the only bone involved would be the ribs and the pelvises. And then the ventral cavity is divided by the diaphragm into thoracic and abdominal pelvic. So the heart is going to be located in the ventral cavity,